I'm here. I'm here. Here we are. Here we go. Amazing. Good afternoon. Good afternoon. This is Dr. Shannon Coates up here in a little town that is about 45 minutes north of Toronto in Ontario, Canada. And these are your live office hours. Or these are my live office hours that you are welcome to partake in. You're here. We're here for some live office hours. And as I am wont to do, I would like to acknowledge the fact that I live and work on the traditional lands of the Haudenosaunee, the Anishinaabe, the Mississauga, and the Wendat-Wendat peoples. And something that is so easy to do is to give land acknowledgements. They've become quite commonplace now, of course. And so I wanted to just do a little recommendation of a book that Anne Slovin recommended to me, which is called A Sentimental Education by Hannah McGregor. And especially to take a look at, I haven't fully dived into this book yet. However, I have looked at the introductory chapter, which, let's be honest, often that's all I read of books. You know, I'm just like, life's too short to read books that aren't great. You know, life is too short to read bad fiction. That is for dang sure. It's way too short to read bad fiction. But certainly too short to read books where you're like, this is not landing. I don't need to get through this, do I? No. Anyway, but having said that, I do want to dive further into it. Again, it's called A Sentimental Education, Hannah McGregor. By Hannah McGregor. But there is, if you should happen to purchase this book, Canadian author, by the way, if you should happen to purchase this book, please do take a look at the territory acknowledgement, which is a solid 10 pages long and really beautifully sums up and talks through what it means to give a land acknowledgement. It says, you know, she says here, but what good is it for me to say so? Meaning, what good is it for me to acknowledge the land and the peoples on the land? While acknowledging territory as an act of protocol has become increasingly widespread in recent years, critics have pointed out how quickly this gesture becomes rote and emptied of meaning. So there's certainly it's a very interesting read, just that opening chapter. It's not even the chapter, it's like a preface. So that's a very interesting read in terms of land acknowledgement, and it's something to consider if you consider, you know, purchasing the book, etc., all that stuff. Okay, let's get into it. So today we're talking about grading and ungrading. As you may know, if you saw my post from yesterday and a few days back, yesterday and Tuesday, I have been sort of diving into this book, Ungrading. Whoop, there we go. Whoa, everybody see it there? Ungrading, edited by Susan Blum. And it has several, it has basically, it lays out the philosophical underpinning for this concept of ungrading to begin with. And the foreword is that I'm going to talk quite a bit from today, is both Susan Blum and the preface, the foreword is, the preface is Susan Blum, and the foreword is, Alfie Kohn. You know, that person, Alfie Kohn. So, it lays out sort of the research, the philosophical underpinnings, all of the understanding that we have around this idea of ungrading. And then there are several, 10 maybe, 12, I don't know, several different people talking about, different educators talking about their experiences with ungrading or applying this concept of a non-achievement based, or how do we figure out how to assess learning, applying all of these ideas in various different classroom situations. So this book is quite classroom based, absolutely. So we'll talk about that in a minute too. But so a lot of folks who have been commenting on the posts that I've made about ungrading have talked about, well, it'll never change in the public school system, or I teach in the public school system, or, academia, et cetera, et cetera. And I just want to say that there are, in this book, if you are in the classroom, if you're in a classroom situation, this book has several models from which to choose, or to sort of take information from people in classrooms, so primary school education, high school education, and from tertiary school education. So all of those different classroom settings are represented in this book, just so you know. So that's something to consider if you're wondering how this kind of looks or applies in an educational setting that you may be in, a classroom setting, right? So this concept of assessment and grading, and the concept, I became disillusioned with this concept when my children were going through school. My children who have, I think I've been fairly upfront about the fact that I tend to do well in the academic setting, so I tend to be able to, do the things that are necessary in order to have it to achieve successfully-ish in the academic setting. And so, I tend to be able to do that. So that's all good. And then when my kids were going through school, and still going through school, when my kids were going through school and we were grappling with learning differences and grappling with accommodations and grappling with independent education plans, and grappling with all of these things that make assessments very challenging, because what are we assessing, right? So an example here where one of the first things that sort of started to really make me disillusioned with this, with the sort of achievement-based grading system, and with the grading system in general, was in early grades for my kids doing spelling tests. So my kids have learning differences which make, so dyslexia and dysgraphia, which make not only recognizing symbols, challenging, so the reading part, recognizing symbols, but also putting those symbols together in order to get meaning from the symbols. That it makes that challenging. But also dysgraphia, dysgraphia isn't very well understood, but in my kids it shows up as a very challenging to remember what the symbols mean and to get them from the brain to the paper. So spelling tests end up being, these, and in the early grades, it is a very common way to assess learning. Except that the spelling tests for my kids it's not assessing learning. It's not. So, and in many, it's assessing whether or not they can remember what the symbol is and whether or not they could remember what order the symbols go in. That's what it's assessing for my kids, and whether or not they can even write the symbol, right? In one of my kids is very challenged by actually even being able to write the symbols. So that's what it was assessing. So in those spelling tests where, and we worked so hard, and my husband, we worked so hard with our kids to help them memorize. They weren't learning the words, they were memorizing the words, right? There was no process of learning here. It was an act, they were acquiring and memorizing the words that were going to be on the spelling test. So all they were doing was gathering these words and putting them in their brain so that they could then put them down on a piece of paper. Hours and hours of work. They didn't learn how to spell from that. That's not the way that my kids' brains work. They didn't learn how to spell. They learned how to memorize. They memorized a few words for sure, but they didn't learn how to put the symbols together in order to create words, and they did not learn how to be able to put symbols together in their mind in order to read words and get meaning from them. So what would have been a better way to assess their learning? Just asking them what the words mean, asking them to recognize the word in the sentence, and asking them what it means. So my kids could, and still can to this day, if you ask them, if you ask them what does government mean, what does, etc. What do these words mean? They're able to articulate very complex concepts. They're able to explain very complex concepts, and they can recognize the word in a paragraph and put the word together with what the meaning is and understand the context of the use of that word. So is a spelling test an actual assessment of their learning? It is not. So that's an example. I mean, that's an example of the assessment protocols that we tend to, of the reason that I became disillusioned with assessment protocols is because of the way that my own kids learn and the way that we do assessment protocols. So assessments, let me just define. When we're talking about Seth says on Abbott Elementary, one of the teachers says, they say don't teach for the test, but if that were true, why are there tests? 100%. And that is so much of what this book talks about too, right? So don't teach to the test, but then why are there tests? We need to change something about these tests, right? So just to define, I mean, I'm going to talk for like a half an hour maybe or 40 minutes here about something that is very complex and messy. So obviously we're not going to get to it all here, and there are about 1,000 caveats, of course, but still going to try. Here we go. So when I'm talking specifically about assessment, I'm talking about achievement-based assessments where the achievement is defined by the instructor. So, or by the person who set the test or the assessment. So the achievement is designed, the achievement, the success of your achievement is decided by me, the instructor. So not by the learner. So anything where we're deciding, where me as the instructor, where I as the instructor am deciding what the achievement should be, that then can become problematic. Whether we're grading or not, that can be problematic, right? Whether we're giving a number grade or not, right? That can be problematic. When there is not a conversation with the learner about what the learning process is, right? Because anyway, so we have formative and cumulative assessments. Formative meaning assessments that are sort of ongoing and are trying to assess learning as we go through. And again, these become problematic when we are not in conversation with the learner about what's actually happening in the learning process. And then cumulative assessments, which are here's one final exam where we put it all together and you show me what you've learned, basically. Or in the case of a studio, maybe it's a final recital, or maybe it's some kind of audition, or etc. Or an exam, an RCM, a Royal Conservatory of Music exam, or any of the the examination systems that we have available for voice or for music. So we have all of those. We have lots of different ways of assessing, lots of different kinds of assessment, lots of different reasons for assessments, etc. So where these assessments become, again, the problem isn't necessarily with the assessment, right? Because we want to have some way to have an ongoing understanding of where we are in the learning process, or where the learner is in the learning process and what they're learning, right? We want to have a way. The problem comes in when we have the instructor deciding what the assessment should be for the learning process without anything coming from the learner, right? With no two-way street, or even one-way street from the learner. So let's go through a couple of these things that I posted the other day. So I posted the other day from the Unlearning. This is from Jesse Stommel's chapter in this book, talking about why grades are not good. So almost always when I'm talking about this, someone says, yes, but the singers I work with do Royal Conservatory of Music exams, and they find it motivating and engaging because they have something to work toward, and then they have this achievement level, right? And that is not necessarily a bad thing. I have used the Royal Conservatory of Music exams extensively in my teaching, and I love to have those as something that is an option for learners, certainly. And at the same time, what we may think of as engagement or motivation, yes, it may be engagement, or it may be someone who is working toward getting an A, rather than learning for the joy of discovery. What do you think is a deeper learning experience? If I'm memorizing and doing all the right things in order to get an A, in order to achieve the A, get the grade, or if I am doing all of these things because I enjoy the discovery of it. And I'm not saying that we can't do RCM exams or we can't do examinations without engendering and building on interest and building on discovery and the joy in learning. Of course we can. But I think we so often get this confused, where we see motivation and we think, oh, look at that beautiful engagement, when in fact it's extrinsic motivation. It's not internal or intrinsic motivation. So intrinsic motivation comes from me being interested in what I am doing and wanting to discover more. And that's the path to deeper learning, versus extrinsic motivation, where I am doing the thing, which makes me contrite, right? It makes me compliant. I'm doing the thing and I'm compliant with my teacher because I want to please the teacher. And this is the way that I can achieve, X, Y, Z, or I can please my parents or whatever, right? And then my parents, who are paying all of this money for voice lessons, get something out of it. They can see that I got a 92% on my conservatory exam. Yay for me. Again, I'm not saying these are necessarily terrible things. I'm just saying that it is challenging. It is easy, to be fooled by the engagement into thinking that we're having some wonderful learning happening here, and intrinsic motivation developing, when in fact it's compliant and extrinsic motivation. I know. So here's the thing. Grades are not good incentive. So this is backed by science. So as I'm reading this, there's tons of research that shows, and lots of the research is in here as well, but there's lots of research that shows that grades are not good incentive, or assessments based on achievements where we're getting grades are not good incentive. And this is something that I've been sort of reaching for, and kind of anecdotally and intuitively being like, I'm not really sure what's going on here. I don't really love this process, but it is what it is. They incentivize the wrong stuff, the product over the process, right? They incentivize the product rather than the process. So in other words, we may be sacrificing the process and the learning when we are incentivizing through grades. And they incentivize what the teacher thinks over what the student thinks. So here's the thing about working with the Royal Conservatory of Music syllabus, or anything like it, right? In England, it's the ABRSM, I think it's called, and there's one in Australia too, and the Royal Conservatory, or the RCM, is in the States now too. Here's the challenge. Sorry, I shouldn't say problem, but here's the challenge. It's really easy to develop curriculum and to teach when you're using the Royal Conservatory of Music syllabus and the examination system. It makes my job really easy as a teacher. Why? Because all I have to do is make sure they've memorized these technical skills and they can, do these technical skills, make sure that they know how to recognize intervals. Not that any of these things are bad, but all I have to do is follow all of these things, right? And then I make sure that they sing all of these songs with, like, they've got the right dynamics, they've got the right phrasing, they've got the right vowels, they've got the right language, they've got the blah, blah, blah. So we just check off all the lists, and all I have to do every week is tell them what to do next. Makes my job so easy, right? What happens when I take away something like the RCM? What happens when I take away some kind of, teaching to the test? What happens when I take that away? All of a sudden, I've got to do some really fancy footwork in terms of my pedagogy, right? All of a sudden, I've now got to work a little bit harder to make sure that there's learning going on. Now I've got to support learning in the voice lesson, right? I've got to support this process of learning, and now I've got to have what Liz Jackson Hearns calls, and I don't know, Liz, whether you coined this or not, but transformational teaching versus transactional teaching. So transformational means like you and I are working together and I am getting your input throughout the process, and I believe that you have everything you need within your voice already. Versus transactional, where I know everything you need and I am going to then set up assessments which tell me whether you have learned everything that I think you need to know about your voice. The second part in here is grades are not good feedback. So again, they are both too simplistic, making something complex into something numerical, and too complicated, offering so many gradations as to be inscrutable. So again, grades are not good feedback. And there's lots of research that shows that when students receive a grade and a comment, they don't read the comment. They only take the grade. They do not get learning from the comment. They only look at the grade. The grade is the thing that impacts them. So as soon as we attach a grade to feedback, we lose the feedback. We lose the effect of the feedback. Feedback, in order to be actual feedback, needs to be an observation of what's happening and then a conversation. So what does that mean in the voice studio? Well, that means that we move from, oh, that was good, based on my perception of what your sound should sound like or what you should be doing next. Oh, you did good. Oh, that was more successful. Oh, you did, like all of that, right? So that's and don't get me wrong, there's nothing wrong with being positive. That's fine. But that's not useful feedback. Useful feedback is, how did you experience that? And if they're not able then yet to come up with their own internalized sensations and their own understanding of what's happening in their process yet, because so many students are not, and that's fine, then the feedback becomes, I observed, I experienced, I heard X, Y, Z. That's what the feedback becomes, not good. And also it becomes, I observed X, Y, Z. Was that close to what you observed? So where we start this conversation in the studio where the feedback is not based on A, B, C, D, E, F, G. It's not based on successful or not successful. It's not based on my opinion of the sound. It's based on what is your opinion of the sound? How did you experience that? So we have transformational versus transactional. All right. Grades are not good markers of learning. I mean, I've already talked about this a little bit, but they too often communicate only a student's ability to follow instructions, not how much she has learned. A 4.0 or higher GPA might indicate excellence, but it might also indicate a student having to compromise their integrity for the sake of a grade. Ouch! Ouch! Ouch, ouch, ouch. So again, what are we actually assessing? Yes, exactly. Isabel's saying, and the student can give feedback too on themselves. Like, exactly, how did you experience that? So that's the whole point, right? Where we're in transformational work. We're working with the student on the assessment, right? The student, we're supporting students as they learn how to self-assess. So that we're supporting students as they learn how to assess their own learning process. We're supporting students as they learn how to understand the process of singing. I wasn't going to say this until the end, but let me throw this in here right now. I was talking recently. We were in one of our group in our lab recently. We were talking about the goal of a singing lesson in the lab in the VoicePed Ungrade. We were talking about the goal of a singing lesson, and we were talking about how so often we think of the goal of a singing lesson where we say to the student, yeah, you're so welcome. Where we say, the goal of the lesson is that you walk out of here singing better than when you walked in. And that sounds good, right? It sounds good. It sounds right. Yeah, that sounds right. Like, yes, I do want them to be singing better than when they walked in. That sounds like good. But drill down a little bit on that. Just drill down a little bit, keeping in mind who defines what is good or who defines what is better, and how do we get to good or better. So when we start to drill down on that and we start to understand this sort of assessment and achievement-based assessment and who sets the parameters for whether or not the achievement is successful, we might redefine the goal of a voice lesson from that they should walk out singing better than when they came in to that they will have a deeper understanding of their process, or they will have more agency in their learning as they walked out the door than when they came in. Because what is our actual role as voice teachers? It's not to actually teach them to be better singers, right? It's not actually that. That's not actually our role. Our role as voice teachers, as all educators, but as voice teachers, is to facilitate the learning process. And if we facilitate and support the learning process, they will become better singers by their parameters, by their standards. They will become better singers in the way that they want to be better singers, right? Yes. Alexa, play Better from Little Women. Exactly. So they will become better singers by the standards that they have for themselves, because we are facilitating the learning process rather than putting a set of standards on what it means to be a better singer. So that changes your mindset when you're in the lesson then, right? That changes a lot about how we interact and the communication we use and all of that kind of thing. That changes a lot. We're talking, I assigned like several sort of practical. Nice, Bailey. Yeah, been trying to find a way to word that. Exactly. Yes, exactly. We're facilitating the learning process, right? We're facilitating the process of learning to sing, which means that we're in a conversation with the singer about what they want to know better. And also it means we trust that the singer has everything they already need inside of themselves, which I thought that I was being super original, but it's totally in the zeitgeist, and I think it's originally from Brene Brown. But we believe that you have what you need inside of yourself. And all I'm here is to coach, right? I'm just here to coach. Anyway, okay. Grades are good markers, not good markers of learning. Grades encourage competitiveness over collaboration, and supposed kindness, like grading on a curve or norming, actually increase competitive by pitting students and sometimes teachers against one another. So again, we come back to this, studios that are super competitive, right? Where students feel like they have to sing. It's a process. Yes, it's a process of discovery. Where students feel and learners feel like their learning process or their learning to sing is compared by their teacher to other people in the studio. So that's what this sort of mindset around grading and around whether or not you are making the sounds that I think you should be making and practicing in the way I think you should be practicing, and that your learning process is the way that it should be according to my parameters. That gets us to competitiveness in the voice studio, where I'm competing against another person because for my teacher's assessment of my achievement. Competitiveness is a little dose of competitiveness sometimes can be very useful, and there are people who really thrive at competitiveness. Do not get me wrong. There are subtleties to this whole conversation and 1,000 caveats as per usual. Learning is messy. Talking about learning is messy. It's all messy. If you saw the if you saw the post I did from, I think it was James Clear, talking about talking about how life is messy and models can never accurately represent life, right? So this is messy. However, competitiveness can be a real challenge to learning and to the discovery process and to the process of, if you're working to get the approval of your voice teacher, especially because you want it over someone else, because the voice teacher has kind of set up that atmosphere. How much joy in discovery and how much joy in the learning process are you actually going to find? How much of that learning are you actually going to find? How much agency are you going to be able to find when what you're actually doing is comparative, right? Where the competition, okay. Grades don't reflect the idiosyncratic, subjective, often emotional character of learning. Oh, zoot allure. They don't. Grades reflect whatever it is that I think you should be, that I as the instructor or the assessment setter think I want you to know. They don't reflect process. They don't reflect idiosyncratic learning. They don't reflect any of those other things. Coming back to the spelling example, the spelling test example that I was talking about at the beginning, the grades on the spelling test reflect whether or not someone is good at memorizing. That's what they reflect. And that's fine. So long as we say that's what this is what we're really testing. If we wanted to do an assessment that might be more useful in terms of the learning process, conversations with a student around, what does this word mean? Why do you think it's spelled this way? What do you see in this word? What might be an interesting way to use this word? Is there another way that you've heard it used? Is there another context that you can think of it being used? When was the last time you heard someone use this word in real life? When was the last time you heard this word in a movie? When was the last time? Etc., etc. That's the kind of conversation and assessment that gets us curious about learning, right? Gets us curious about words. Those kinds of questions get us curious. and get us into the learning process. So the more we can have this conversation, the more we can have this process-based, like discovery-based learning in the voice studio, probably the more learning, and you know what? Probably the more practicing students will do. All right, here we go. Finally, grades aren't fair, and they will never be fair. And by fair, this author means equitable. So we have this myth. There is a myth that grades are scientific and objective. It is a myth. So I am going to botch up this research. However, I'm really paraphrasing it, and you can look it up for reals if you want. From a curriculum design perspective, if we gave more or better attention to program outcomes assessment, we would be much less dependent on grades in individual courses. Yes, I mean, there are lots of, Seth, I absolutely think that is part of the equation. Absolutely. And there are lots of different, in this book, again, there are lots of different ways and models that people are using to kind of try to take that grading out, and like, how do we find that learning outcome, right? Like, how do we find that? Yeah. And how do we assess learning, right? Like all of these big questions. There's lots of people answering those questions in this book, and there are lots of people, you know, the whole foreword and the whole preface in the book is talking about, here's the problem. We don't have a good solution yet, but here are some of the ways that people are trying to solve this problem. Yeah, we don't have a great solution yet. It also talks about the history of grading, which is also really interesting if you ever wanted to get into that. The history of where grades came from and how they came out of the Industrial Revolution, etc. You know, not all in all cultures, but and also how initially, you know, oral exams were like a discussion-based examination was the focus rather than, yeah. And so that brings me back to this sort of myth where we think, okay, because it's graded, it's objective and it's fair because everybody's being graded with the same grading rubric or the same blah, blah, blah. You know, everybody has the same. And so they've done some research, and this is so true in our like auditions in the voice world as well, right? So true in auditions, so true in folks getting into universities. Like all of this it applies all the way across the voice world too, where folks using grading rubrics or exams in the arts. Several different graders were given the same exams to grade, and same essays, if I remember correctly, and same grading rubrics and all that stuff. And the grades varied by like 20% or something along those lines. And so then they were like, okay, well, if we do this in like math, where there's no, you know, it's an objective answer, it's going to be like one or the other, right? Like it has to be the right number in math. Then we're going to get a very, like, it's not going to be very much variation in the outcome, right? In the grading outcome. Turns out there was more variation in the grading outcomes in math than there were in arts grading. And again, I'm totally paraphrasing off the top of my head all this stuff, but the point remains that grades are not objective. They're not equal. They're not fair. They're not equitable. Grades are not objective. It doesn't matter how objective, you know, how like how objective the answer should be or could be, right? It's just not. So anyway, that's a myth. So then they go on to say here, all of this understanding about grades and assessments and achievement-based assessments demands exactly two pedagogical approaches. And you're going to love this first one because I've been saying it for a long time. I love it. The first one, start by trusting students. What? Start by trusting students. That's the first one. And the second one is realize fairness is not a good excuse for a lack of compassion. So, I've talked lots and lots and lots about trusting students, student-led learning, developing student-led learning, et cetera, et cetera. Talk a lot, and student agency, right? Oh yeah, absolutely, Isabel. Yeah, it also depends on the approach of the teacher. Certainly does. We all know of how students do well if they have a different teacher or a different approach, or even just a different personality. Like absolutely. I mean, this is all part of the problem, right? Like this is all part of the issue. Yeah, and even if they use the same rubric, they'll get different results. 100%. Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. This is all part of the problem. Just basically grades aren't fair, right? So like I said, I've talked lots and lots about start by trusting the students. So if we go into the studio, if we go into the voice studio, assuming that everyone is doing the best with what they have, or in the situation with, in which they find themselves, which again, I think is Brene Brown, but I honestly don't remember where I first heard it, but I've been using it for a long time now. We start with everyone is doing the best with what they have or where they are within the situation they find themselves in. As well as the student has everything, the singer we're working with in front of us has everything they need already to accomplish the sounds and the tonal outcomes and to be able to communicate in the way they want to communicate. And my job is to trust the student. That starts a whole different way of teaching, right? Like that has some implications, some very strong implications for the way that we work in the voice studio. And then the second thing here, realize that fairness is not a good excuse for a lack of compassion. Meaning, so in the voice studio, this comes out, a prime example is like this comes out in punitive, or what I call punitive cancellation policies, right? Well, it needs to be fair for everyone. Fairness is not an excuse for a lack of compassion. Ouch. Ouch. 24-hour cancellation policy. It's just fair for everyone. If that's getting your hackles up a little bit, know that there's more to it than that, and I have done lives on that before too. So there's search for, I can't remember, maybe under Inclusive Voice Studios, that might be somewhere to look for that, and I'll see if I can get some links into the comments on Facebook as well. So keep that in mind. Fairness, as soon as you are saying to yourself, or you find yourself saying to someone in the studio, oh, well, I have to have this policy in order for it to be fair for everyone. Consider that maybe you don't have to have that policy in order for it to be fair for everyone. Consider that. All right. I'm going to leave it there. So if you are the reading type, it's a terrific book. It's not it is very practical. So it's not it is not it's not super dense. It's very practical. Lots of interesting ideas from different educators in different systems and in different academic settings. So very practical. Oh, sorry. It's called Ungrading. Oh, it's kind of backwards in there. But anyway, it's called Ungrading. I will put links to it as well. And it's edited by Susan D. Blum, Blum, Ungrading. Yeah. And it's, I think it's 2020. It's fairly recent. But Susan Blum has put out lots, you're so welcome. Susan Blum has put out lots of articles, etc. before, as well as Alfie gosh, why did the name go out of my head there? Alfie Kohn, is that right? Yeah, Kohn, as well. Well, that's the thing. This book talks very specifically about classrooms and schools, academic settings, etc. However, the principles are absolutely applicable in the private studio as well, in an independent studio as well. Right. So it's that's such a good question. Never heard of grading in private studios. Yes. It's just the way that the concept of grading and the philosophical underpinning of grading sneaks into our studios, right? So it sneaks into our studios in in how we compare student to student, in how we decide whether or not a student is singing the right way or not, in how we in how we manage tonal outcomes, etc. Right? So it's all this philosophical underpinning, right, around agency and around like who's the teacher, right? So that all just sneaks into the independent studio, not necessarily in the form of actual grades. Although sometimes, like I said, I have used the Royal Conservatory of Music lots, and yeah, or even in small group settings. Yes, exactly. Terrific. Okay. Have a great weekend. Let me know if any of that resonated with you, and how we define success. Exactly. Yes, Seth, that is a very common way that the underpinning around ungrading or grading or achievement-based success or achievement-based assessment sneaks into the studio in terms of how we define success, right? Because it becomes how I, as the instructor, define success versus that transformational work where we are working, where the learner and I are working together to define success. Okay, super fun. Have fun. Read that if you want, or don't. It's all good. But definitely do think about those two principles, which I love. Okay, you're so welcome. Have a great day and a good weekend. Bye. And there, let's end over here. Boop.